Welcome to another deep dive, everybody. We've got some really interesting source material you sent in.
Yeah, this is going to be good.
It's excerpts from a book called Crystallizing Public Opinion, and it was written way back in 1925
Wow,
by a guy named Edward Bernays.
that's right.
And today we're going to look into how this early public relations expert saw the public and how he thought opinions could be influenced.
Okay, so this Edward Bernays, he was one of the first people to actually call himself a public relations counsel.
That's interesting.
Yeah. What do you think that meant back then?
I don't know, it sounds pretty vague.
Well, it was definitely a new type of expert back then, like someone who really understood the public and how to really connect with them.
Not just trying to sell them something.
Exactly. Bernays actually thought that the public was pretty complex.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and constantly looking for information and acting as judge and jury in all sorts of issues.
So not just some mindless mass to be manipulated?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
Bernays really saw them as a force to be reckoned with.
That's kind of cool.
He had this great analogy where he compared reaching the public to a lawyer who's presenting a case to a jury.
Right.
You wouldn't use all this complex legal jargon that's going to go over their head.
You got to speak their language, right?
Exactly. Bernays thought you need to tailor your message to your audience, understanding their beliefs and what they already know.
So it's he was thinking about audience segmentation and targeted messaging way back then.
It really is fascinating stuff. He was way ahead of his time.
So how did Bernays think about the media?
Well, he saw the press as a huge force, of course.
Makes sense.
But he also recognized that newspapers were businesses.
Oh, right. They need to make money.
Yeah, and they had to cater to public taste to actually stay afloat.
So it wasn't just about reporting the facts even back then.
I think it was also about giving people what they wanted to read.
That's interesting.
Bernays had a pretty cynical take on it. He said that newspapers have to adapt their content to their audience's limitations.
Oh.
Just like a lawyer would adapt their arguments to a jury.
I never thought about it that way.
Makes you wonder how much of what we read is shaped by those considerations.
Yeah, for sure.
It's a question worth thinking about.
Totally.
He used the example of the New York Times motto.
All the news that's fit to print.
Yes. To show how even choosing what news to print is totally subjective and tied to what the public expects.
So what gets left out is just as important as what gets included.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about Bernays' thoughts on the media.
Right.
What about his views on the public itself? He did a lot of work on group psychology, right?
Yeah, and this is where it gets really interesting. Bernays was fascinated by how people act in groups.
Mm-hmm.
He actually used terms like crowd mind and herd reaction
Herd reaction, I like that.
to explain how individuals can be influenced more easily when they're part of a bigger group.
It's that feeling of wanting to fit in right.
Totally. Or even the fear of standing out.
Peer pressure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He argued that people in groups are often driven by this need for conformity and security.
Interesting.
And they're more likely to follow the lead of others, especially those they see as leaders.
So if you can understand that group dynamic, you can potentially sway a lot of people all at once.
Yeah, that's the idea.
Wow.
Bernays actually thought that understanding these group dynamics was crucial for anyone who wanted to influence public opinion.
That makes a lot of sense.
He went even further and identifying specific human instincts he thought could be leveraged.
He did. What kind of instincts are we talking about?
Well, he had a whole list.
Okay.
He called them the 7 primary instincts that drive how humans behave.
Okay, listening.
These were things like flight fear,
Okay.
repulsion disgust, curiosity wonder, pugnacity anger, self-display elation, self-abasement subjection, and parental love tenderness.
Wow, that's quite a list.
Yeah, a lot.
And he thought these instincts could be used to make messages more persuasive.
Exactly. And he gives some pretty interesting examples of how this played out in real campaigns.
Like what?
Well, think about campaigns against tuberculosis back then.
Okay.
They often framed it as a fight against the disease.
So they were tapping into that instinct to fight back against a threat?
Right. They wanted to rally public support.
That makes sense.
Or what about the parental love instinct?
How did that play out?
Well, think about those post-war charity appeals with pictures of starving orphans.
Oh, yeah.
They were meant to trigger that strong sense of compassion and that urge to protect the vulnerable.
It's amazing how much psychology goes into this stuff.
It really is.
Yeah.
Bernays really believed that a good public relations counsel needed to be a bit of a psychologist, too.
Interesting.
You have to understand what makes people tick if you want to craft messages that really resonate.
So we've talked about the public, the media, even human instincts.
Right.
But how did Bernays think he should actually go about crafting these persuasive messages? Did he have any specific techniques?
He did. Bernays was a big believer in simplicity and clarity.
Keep it simple, right?
He emphasized that a message has to be easy to understand and remember to be effective.
I can see how that would be important, especially with so much information out there.
Exactly. You got to cut through the noise and make your message stick.
That's a good point.
He advocated for using vivid imagery and even what he called stereotypes to quickly evoke emotions and associations.
Stereotypes. Isn't that a little risky?
It can be. But Bernays said that stereotypes, whether we like them or not, are powerful tools for shaping how people see things.
That's true.
He thought you could use them to reinforce a message or even fight against existing ones.
Do you have any examples of how that worked?
He gave the example of Austria trying to gain public support after the war.
Okay.
He suggested they could play up those positive stereotypes about Austria, like the Danube Waltz and Danube Blue.
Oh, I see.
Those images evoke a feeling of like happiness and charm and could shift how people saw Austria away from the negative associations with war.
So you're trying to reframe the narrative by using things people already associate with a place or idea.
Exactly. Did he have any other examples of this stereotype strategy?
He talked about how Roosevelt was really good at creating stereotypes.
Like what?
Terms like square deal, delighted mollycoddle, and big stick.
I can see how those words would create really strong images in people's minds.
Exactly. And they helped shape how the public felt about his policies,
It's really amazing how much power a simple word or phrase can have.
especially if it taps into something that already exists in people's minds.
Bernays totally understood that he was all about using those existing frameworks and associations to make a message stick.
So he's got this deep understanding of psychology and a strategic way of approaching messaging.
Right.
But what about the actual methods for swaying the public? What did he have to say about that?
Well, Bernays outlined several different methods, and they're still relevant today.
Really?
One idea is staging events.
To, like, get people talking.
Exactly, to generate news and grab public attention.
Like that hotel that hired a famous chef to fight those bad rumors.
Yeah, exactly. Bernays gave a whole bunch of examples of events that could do this, like launching battleships with these huge ceremonies to organizing protests and rallies,
Things like ribbon cuttings, product launches, even publicity stunts.
all designed to create buzz and get people talking about a cause or a client.
So it's not enough to just have a good message.
No, you have to make it stand out.
Right, because there's so much information out there.
Exactly. You got to grab people's attention.
He was also big on using a variety of different mediums to spread the message, right?
Yes. He talked about everything from film and radio to word-of-mouth communication, which he saw as super powerful.
Even today with social media, we can see how much influence people have within their own networks.
It's that whole idea of social proof, right?
We're more likely to listen to someone we trust.
Or someone who's part of our community.
Right.
Bernays even suggested finding and building relationships with key influencers, what we might call thought leaders today.
That makes a lot of sense.
It's not just about using mass media. It's about building these networks of influence.
And tapping into the power of personal recommendations.
Exactly. It's incredible how many of his ideas are still relevant in today's world.
Even with all the changes in how we get our information.
It's pretty wild.
What about film and radio? How did Bernays see those fitting in?
Well, Bernays saw the power of film to shape how people see things.
For sure.
He even suggested making educational films to sway opinion on certain topics, like the need for better subways in a big city.
Like the documentaries we see today.
Exactly. He was way ahead of his time.
He understood that film could bring an issue to life and make it more real for the audience.
Not just entertainment.
Yeah.
He saw it as a powerful tool for persuasion and education.
Show, don't tell.
Right. And what about radio? That was a pretty new thing back then.
Yeah, I guess so.
Bernays saw that it had the potential to reach a huge audience all at the same time.
Makes sense.
He suggested that public relations experts could use radio by organizing discussions or having important people give speeches on certain issues.
Like fireside chats, but for all sorts of causes.
It was a way to go around traditional media and speak directly to the public.
Which is something we still see today, just using different platforms.
Right.
It's pretty cool to think about how Bernays' ideas might have evolved with podcasts and social media and everything.
For sure.
But before we go too far, I want to come back to those ethical considerations.
Right.
It's one thing to be persuasive, but where do we draw the line?
That's the big question, right?
Yeah.
And it's one that Bernays himself struggled with.
Hmm.
He knew that public relations walked a fine line between education and propaganda.
That's a good point.
He even said that people were getting more and more skeptical of attempts to manipulate their opinions.
People are getting smarter.
Yeah, they're demanding more transparency.
Makes sense.
Bernays thought that the key to ethical persuasion was appealing to people's conscience, not just their emotions or instincts.
So appealing to their sense of right and wrong.
Exactly. A real public relations professional, he thought, should try to create a public that's more informed and engaged.
Not just trying to trick them.
Right. It's about elevating the conversation and helping people make good decisions.
That's a really important point. It makes his work even more relevant today, don't you think?
Definitely, especially in a world where we're constantly bombarded with information and misinformation.
It's like he's giving us a framework for how to think critically about all the messages we're exposed to.
He's reminding us that we all have a responsibility to be informed and engaged citizens.
That's a powerful message.
It really is. One thing Bernays really emphasized was understanding all the different groups that make up the public.
So not just some generic public, but like recognizing that people have all these different interests and beliefs and reasons for doing things.
Yeah, exactly. He actually called them interlapping group formations.
Interesting.
That's the idea that people belong to all these different groups, like based on their job or hobbies or religion and stuff.
It's like today with social media and online communities.
Right? People have so many different identities and groups they belong to.
Exactly.
It makes reaching people a lot more complicated than just putting out like one message.
Yeah, you can't just say one thing and expect everyone to react the same way.
Bernays gives this example of a charity organization that was really successful because they tailored their appeals to different groups.
Smart.
Like they reached out to business leaders
Yeah.
by focusing on their like philanthropic side,
Mm-hmm.
their desire to give back.
Okay.
And they appealed to socialites by emphasizing the organization's prestige and reputation.
So playing to different motivations.
Exactly. And they even reached out to specific religious communities by tapping into their shared values.
It's brilliant. Like by understanding those different circles of influence, you can reach the same people in multiple ways.
And increase the chances that your message will actually resonate with them.
It's like a multi-pronged approach hitting different touch points.
Exactly. And it brings up another point that Bernays makes about human nature being flexible.
Okay.
He's saying that public opinion isn't fixed,
People can change their minds.
especially when their circumstances change or they get new information.
Makes sense.
Bernays uses the example of public opinion shifting towards government ownership of railroads
Oh, interesting.
after this huge strike caused a lot of problems for people.
So their experience like directly influenced their opinion.
Exactly. A skilled public relations counsel can use these shifts, and frame their message in a way that aligns with where the public is at.
It's about being adaptable and understanding the context of the situation.
Right,
So we've talked about understanding the public and choosing the right mediums.
right.
What about actually crafting those impactful messages? What kind of specific methods did Bernays suggest
Well, you might remember we talked about staging events.
to generate news and get people's attention?
Exactly. Like that hotel that hired a famous chef to combat those bad rumors.
Yeah, that was a good one.
Bernays actually had a whole list of events that could serve this purpose, from
Yeah.
like launching battleships with these big fancy ceremonies to organizing demonstrations and rallies.
Things like ribbon cuttings, product unveilings, even publicity stunts.
All designed to create buzz and get people talking.
So it's not enough to just have a good message. You have to find a way to make it stand out,
Right, because everyone's competing for attention.
especially in a world that's constantly bombarded with information.
You have to break through the noise.
He was also really big on using a bunch of different mediums to spread the message.
Yeah, he talked about everything from film and radio to word-of-mouth communication, which he thought was incredibly powerful.
Even in today's world with social media, we see how much influence people have within their own networks.
Right, it's like that idea of social proof,
We're way more likely to be persuaded by someone we trust.
or someone who's part of our community.
Exactly.
Bernays even suggested identifying and cultivating relationships with these key influencers that we might call thought leaders today.
So it's not just about mass media, it's about building those personal connections.
Exactly. You're tapping into the power of personal recommendations.
It's amazing how much of what he was saying is still relevant today.
I know, it's crazy, right?
What about film and radio? How did Bernays see those fitting into the picture?
Well, Bernays definitely recognized how powerful film was in shaping how people saw things.
For sure.
He even suggested creating educational films to try and sway people's opinions on certain issues, like the need for better subways in a big city.
Like those documentaries or advocacy films we see today.
Yeah, he understood that film could really bring an issue to life, make it more real for the audience.
Not just entertainment.
He saw it as a powerful tool for both persuasion and education.
And what about radio? That was a pretty new medium back then, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was, and Bernays really saw its potential to reach a huge audience all at once.
You could bypass the traditional media gatekeepers and just talk directly to the public.
Exactly. And he suggested that public relations experts could use radio to organize discussions or have important people give speeches on their topic.
It's like those fireside chats, but for all sorts of different causes.
It's a strategy we still see today, just using different platforms.
It's really interesting to think about how Bernays' ideas might have evolved in today's world with all the different ways we consume information now.
It's a whole different landscape.
But for now, I want to circle back to those ethical considerations.
Okay.
It's one thing to be persuasive, but where do we draw the line between ethical persuasion and manipulation?
It's a question that's still relevant today, and it's one that Bernays himself struggled with.
He knew that public relations could be used for good or for bad.
Right. He recognized that it walked this fine line between education and propaganda.
Interesting.
He even said that the public was becoming more and more skeptical of attempts to manipulate their opinions.
People are getting smarter.
They're demanding more transparency.
They want to know who's behind the message and what their agenda is.
Exactly. Bernays thought that the key to ethical persuasion was to appeal to people's conscience.
Not just their emotions or instincts.
He thought a real public relations professional should try to create a more informed and engaged public.
So it's not just about winning the argument.
It's about elevating the conversation and helping people make good decisions.
That's a really important point. It makes his work even more relevant today, don't you think?
Absolutely, especially in a world where we're constantly dealing with information overload and misinformation.
It's like he's giving us a framework for how to think critically about all the messages we're exposed to.
He's reminding us that we all have a responsibility to be informed and engaged citizens.
That's a powerful message.
It really is.
Yeah, it really is a lot to process.
Yeah.
Bernays was writing like almost 100 years ago.
I know, right?
But his ideas about public relations and the need for ethical persuasion feel super relevant today.
I agree. It's like he's giving us this guide for how to think critically when we're faced with all these messages trying to persuade us.
It's like knowing how the magician does their tricks.
Right.
The illusion isn't as effective when you see how it's done.
Exactly.
But Bernays doesn't just expose those tricks. He really emphasizes this idea of a public conscience.
Right.
What do you think he meant by that?
I think that's where we go beyond just understanding the mechanics of public relations,
Okay,
and we start thinking about values and responsibility.
right.
Bernays argued that a healthy public sphere needs people to be informed, engaged, and driven by a sense of shared purpose.
Interesting.
He thought public opinion should be based on something more than just like fleeting emotions or manipulation.
So it's not just about blindly following the crowd or being swayed by the loudest voice.
No, it's about really thinking about the messages we're bombarded with,
Okay.
considering different perspectives and forming our own opinions based on reason and evidence.
It sounds like he's calling for a more thoughtful and like deliberative public discourse.
Yeah,
But is that even realistic in today's world? Like everything moves so fast and people's attention spans are so short.
it's definitely a challenge, but I think recognizing the problem is the first step.
Right.
We need to be aware of the things that shape our opinions,
Okay.
question our assumptions, and have real conversations even when we disagree.
It's like Bernays is giving us this pep talk for being responsible citizens in the age of information.
He's reminding us that we all have a role to play in shaping public discourse.
Right.
We can just passively consume information and be easily swayed by clever messaging,
Right.
or we can be active participants demanding transparency, critical thinking, and a focus on the greater good.
So he's basically saying that the future of public discourse is up to us.
And that's a powerful message.
Yeah, it really is. Bernays was obviously a master of understanding how the public thinks and how to influence opinions.
Right.
But he also believed that this power should be used to elevate, not just manipulate.
I think that's something we should all remember.
Absolutely, whether we're in the business of persuasion or just trying to make sense of the world around us.
This has been a really fascinating deep dive.
Yeah, Bernays was clearly ahead of his time.
And his ideas are more relevant today than ever.
I think the big takeaway is that we all need to be more aware of the things that shape our opinions.
And the techniques that are used to try and persuade us.
The more we understand about how public relations works
The better we'll be at navigating all this information out there.
and making informed decisions for ourselves.
So what stood out to you most from this deep dive into Edward Bernays and the world of public relations? We'd love to hear your thoughts.
Thanks for joining us for another deep dive, everybody.